What would you do if your entire life turned out to be a lie? Could you handle the truth if the person you loved had a secret so dark it could destroy your entire world? In this true crime case, we delve into the horrifying story of a woman who uncovered a devastating secret about her husband, a secret that led to one of the most brutal murders in Brooklyn's history. This isn't just a story of betrayal. It's about trust shattered, deception spiraling into madness, and a marriage tainted by the darkest of truths. In the end, the revelation wasn't just life-changing, it was deadly. They lived in Brooklyn, a picturesque neighborhood that seemed straight out of a postcard. The brownstone townhouse they called home was warm and inviting, nestled among streets where children played and neighbors waved as they passed by. To anyone who looked at them, Susan and David were the epitome of the ideal couple. The kind of couple you might see in family magazines or in the pages of a church newsletter. They were everything people strive to be: successful, kind-hearted, deeply committed to their faith. Susan, a driven real estate agent, had built her career from the ground up. She was known for her work ethic, her charm, and her unshakable belief in the power of hard work and perseverance. People trusted her, not just because of her professionalism, but because of her warmth. It was a warmth that extended beyond her work, to every person she met. To her, life was about relationships. She was the kind of person who would go out of her way to make you feel welcome, seen, and heard. And then there was David, the very embodiment of a small-town pastor, loved by his congregation, respected by the community, and admired for his unwavering faith. His sermons were filled with wisdom, his eyes always shining with conviction as he spoke about love, family, and the importance of living a righteous life. To Susan, David was the rock on which she built her world. He was her guiding light, the one she turned to for solace, for strength, and for comfort. Together they had created a life that most people could only dream of, a life that was grounded in faith, trust, and the belief that nothing was more important than the bond they shared. But there was something more to this picture-perfect life than met their eye. As close as Susan and David were, there was a distance between them, an invisible barrier that neither could quite explain. It wasn't that they didn't love each other, of that there was no doubt. Their love was real, genuine, and rooted in action. But despite the surface-level perfection, something was missing, something critical. Now, don't mistake this for a lack of affection. They kissed, they held hands, they went on walks through the park, and they shared quiet evenings together, sitting out side by side in front of the fireplace, reading their favorite scriptures. They were, by all appearances, the kind of couple whose bond could withstand any challenge. But when it came to intimacy, the kind that went beyond physical affection, there was a noticeable absence. It was something that Susan had quietly struggled with for years. Early on in their relationship, she assumed it was just a phase. Maybe it was the pressures of their busy lives, or perhaps it was just a natural progression in a relationship where two people had already forged a deep emotional connection. But the months turned to years, and the gap only seemed to widen. The conversation that she had dreaded, the one that would address the tension between them, never seemed to happen. David, always the devout man, had insisted that they wait until after marriage. He believed that their bond was so strong, so pure, that they didn't need physical intimacy to define their love. His reasoning was simple: true intimacy, the kind that mattered, could only come after a lifelong commitment. And for him, that commitment made in front of God was sacred. To Susan, it made sense at first. After all, he was a pastor, and she trusted him, respected him. She had no reason to question his decision. But as the years went on, the frustration began to settle in. She began to wonder whether there was something more to David's insistence. Something she didn't understand. It wasn't that she hadn't tried to talk to him about it, but she had. Countless times she had tried to break through that wall, to bring up her own desires, her own needs, the quiet longing she felt in the quietest moments of their days. But each time she broached the subject, David deflected, choosing instead to focus on their shared goals, their spiritual connection, the way they could build a life that was pleasing to God. His words were convincing, always gentle, always loving, but after a while, Susan couldn't ignore the sense of isolation that crept in. Why was it so hard for him to talk about it? Why was it so difficult to address the growing gap between them? And was it possible that David, the man who seemed to have an answer for everything, was keeping something from her? The questions hung in the air, unanswered and unsettling. Susan often found herself looking at David from across the room, trying to read his expression, searching for any sign that he, too, felt the distance that had slowly crept into their relationship. His smile was always warm, always reassuring. His touch, though tender, felt distant, as if he were holding back. And every time she tried to get closer to him, to understand him more fully, it felt like she was running up against an invisible barrier, a barrier that David never acknowledged, but that Susan couldn't seem to cross. David, for his part, remained unwavering. His faith, his commitment to their shared values, was something that defined him, something that Susan admired, even as it kept her at arm's length. He had always been the one to make decisions, the one who led their relationship with quiet authority. He had an answer for every question. His certainty was a kind of shield. But behind that shield, what was he hiding? Could it be that the very thing that made their relationship seem so perfect, their unwavering faith, their shared values, was also the thing that kept them apart? It was the image of their perfect life, an image so carefully crafted, so meticulously protected, starting to unravel. And if it was, would Susan ever be ready for the truth that lay beneath the surface? Or was she already too deep into the illusion, too committed to the life they had built, to even see the cracks that were beginning to appear? One thing was clear: something had to give. The tension between them was palpable, even if neither of them was willing to admit it. The life they had built, so seemingly perfect, was beginning to show signs of strain. How long could it last before everything came crashing down? It was supposed to be the night that changed everything, the night that sealed their commitments, their devotion to one another, their marriage, a night they had waited for years. And Susan had imagined it countless times in her head, the night when she and David would finally close the distance that had quietly grown between them. It was supposed to be a moment of connection, of understanding, of stepping into a new chapter of their lives together. But as Susan lay in the soft glow of the candles that illuminated their bedroom that night, she couldn't shake the feeling of disconnection. Something felt off. The excitement that should have come with the culmination of their shared journey didn't arrive. Instead, there was an unsettling emptiness that lingered in her chest. David, as always, was gentle and attentive, guiding her through the evening with the same calm assurance he always exuded. His soft words of comfort and his tender touch were a stark contrast to the strange tension Susan felt inside. She had been so sure that this moment would bring them closer, sure that it would break down the walls that had grown between them. But as the night wore on, Susan felt herself growing more and more disoriented. The sweetness of the wine David had poured for her seemed to wrap her in a fog, dulling the sharpness of her thoughts. She hadn't even noticed how much she had drunk, or why she was suddenly so tired. The room seemed to tilt slightly, the walls closing in, and then she drifted into sleep. When she awoke, everything felt wrong. Her head was heavy, her limbs sore in a way that made no sense. A dull ache in her muscles, in places she hadn't expected. The sheets felt strange against her skin, and she couldn't quite remember how she had gotten there, or why her body felt as though it had been put through a gauntlet in the night. The disorientation was immediate, sharp, and unsettling. She reached for David beside her, but the bed was empty. She could hear the faint sound of him moving about in the other room. Susan's mind raced. Had something happened? Had she blacked out? The memory gaps were so stark, so jarring. It wasn't like her to forget anything, especially not something as important as her wedding night. Yet there she was, struggling to piece together the events of the evening. How could she not remember? How could she not remember a single thing after that glass of wine? David came in then, as though he had anticipated her questions before she could even ask them. His face, serene and calm, held no trace of concern. He looked at her as though the night had gone exactly as planned, as though everything had gone perfectly. "Were you feeling all right?" he asked, his voice low, warm. Miss Susan nodded, but inside she wasn't sure. She wasn't sure about anything anymore. The days following their wedding night seemed to follow a strange, repetitive pattern. Each evening, David would offer her a drink, always something light, always with a smile. And each morning, Susan would awaken with the same soreness in her body, the same feeling of having been somewhere, done something, but with no recollection of the previous night. It was like living in a fog that only seemed to grow thicker with time. It started off small. Little moments she couldn't recall, fragments of conversations she was sure she had had, but which seemed to vanish the moment she tried to hold on to them. But soon the gaps became more pronounced, more unsettling. Some mornings she would wake up in a strange state of confusion, unsure of whether she had dreamt something or lived it. She would feel as though she were waking up in someone else's life, a life that didn't quite make sense. And all the while, David seemed to be unaffected, always calm, always steady. His answers to her unasked questions were too quick, too rehearsed. "You're fine, darling. You just need rest," he would say with a reassuring smile. But Susan couldn't shake the growing sense that something wasn't right. Her suspicions, once vague and fleeting, were starting to take root. There had to be an explanation for the strange sensations, the disorientation, the gaps in her memory. There had to be something she was missing. And the pattern, it was becoming clear. Every night, David would offer her the same glass of wine. Every night, she would drink it, grateful for his thoughtfulness, grateful for his care. What felt like part of their ritual, a way to unwind after the busy days. And every morning, she would awake with the same strong soreness, the same empty feeling, the same sense of disconnection. Is this what life had become? A haze, a series of moments that slipped through her fingers like water. David's calm demeanor was starting to feel less like reassurance and more like something else. Was he hiding something from her? Was he aware of what was happening to her? And more chillingly, was he responsible for it? The thought seemed impossible. David, her husband, the man she trusted above all others, could he really be the one orchestrating this strange, disorienting pattern? Could he be controlling her in ways she couldn't even comprehend? As Susan tried to shake the thought, tried to reason with herself. Maybe it was just stress. Maybe it was all in her head. But the more the pattern repeated, the more it became impossible to ignore. One night, as she prepared for bed, Susan made a decision. She would stop drinking the wine. Just for one night, she would refuse. She didn't want to believe it, but the growing unease in her stomach had become too much to dismiss. She needed answers. She needed clarity. When David came to her with the glass, his smile was just as warm as always. "A drink before bed, darling?" he asked. For a moment, Susan hesitated. Then she smiled, though her heart was pounding in her chest. "No, thank you, David. Not tonight." David didn't react right away. He merely nodded, the smile still fixed on his face. "All right, love. Whatever you need." That night, she lay in bed wide awake, her mind racing. She watched as David turned off the lights and lay beside her, just as he always did. There was something unnerving about the silence, about the stillness between them. She could feel his presence, but it was distant, his body beside hers, but not his soul. Hours passed, and Susan tried to stay awake, tried to be alert. Her eyes fluttered, her thoughts sharp. She needed to know, needed to understand what was happening to her. But eventually sleep took her anyway. When she awoke the next morning, it was with the same feeling of disorientation. The soreness in her body, the strange sense that she had been somewhere, had done something, yet could not recall a single moment. The difference this time was that the drink hadn't been involved. She hadn't drunk it. Her stomach churned as she looked over at David, who lay peacefully beside her, as though he had nothing to hide. How could he not know? How could he not understand the havoc this was wreaking on her mind? When this wasn't just a bad night, this wasn't just stress or exhaustion. Something was happening, something beyond her control, and she couldn't shake the feeling that David knew more than he was letting on. Was it possible that the man she had trusted most, the man who had promised her a lifetime of love and devotion, was the very one who was tearing her world apart? Would she ever find the truth? Or was she already too deep, too lost to see it? As the months dragged on, a quiet but insidious frustration began to settle in Susan's chest. Her once clear sense of purpose was now clouded with doubt. And the life she had worked so hard to build with David, the life that had seemed so perfect, so safe, felt increasingly hollow. The disorientation from her memory gaps continued. But now there was something new, something more troubling gnawing at her. The lingering absence of the one thing he had hoped for more than anything. For years, Susan had dreamed of becoming a mother. She had envisioned the joy, the laughter, the tiny hands in hers, the promise of a family filled with love. She and David had discussed it many times before their wedding, how they would start their family, how they would raise their children with faith, instilling in them the same values that had shaped their own lives. But as the months passed after their wedding, Susan found herself increasingly disappointed. Month after month, with no sign of pregnancy. At first, she had thought it was just a matter of timing, or perhaps stress from their busy schedules. But now it was becoming more than just a worry, it was a growing concern. Susan tried to hide her frustration from David, tried to keep her unease masked behind her smile. She didn't want to seem impatient, didn't want to seem ungrateful for the life they had. After all, they had each other, didn't they? They had their faith, their home, their careers. It should have been enough. But the more she thought about it, the more Susan realized that it wasn't enough. Not anymore. Why wasn't she pregnant? Why was it taking so long? Was there something wrong with her? Or was there something else at play? Every time she broached the subject with David, his answers were always the same. It'll happen when the time is right. Oh, we need to trust God's plan. It sounded so perfect, so reassuring, like everything else about their life together. But deep down, Susan knew that there was more to it. She could feel it, like an itch she couldn't scratch. Something wasn't right. And the more she thought about it, the more her doubts about David's intentions began to deepen. Was David, the loving husband, truly as devoted to her as he claimed? Was he hiding something from her, something beyond the boundaries of their perfect marriage, something that went against everything he had promised? The disorientation she had felt in their bed, the soreness that came with every morning, the memory poise, could all of it be connected to something more sinister? Was David deliberately withholding something from her, manipulating her in ways she couldn't understand? For weeks, Susan's thoughts spiraled around this question. She tried to push them away, tried to convince herself that she was simply being paranoid, but the feeling never truly left her. It lingered in the back of her mind, growing stronger with every passing day. It was like a shadow that refused to leave, a whisper that wouldn't fade into silence. So one evening, after another fruitless attempt to conceive, Susan sat alone in the living room, her thoughts heavy and clouded. The TV played softly in the background, but she wasn't paying attention to it. But she was thinking about the one thing that had been eating away at her, the idea that David was hiding something from her, that perhaps he was the one standing between her and the life she had dreamed of. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something, that there was a truth she wasn't seeing. She had to know, she had to find out what was happening. If she couldn't trust her husband, if she couldn't trust what she thought was the foundation of their marriage, what did she have left? That night, Susan made a decision. She would find the answers, no matter how difficult they might be. She couldn't keep living in this fog of uncertainty. She needed proof. She needed to know what was really going on. The next day, she went to a local electronics store under the guise of shopping for new security cameras for the house. Her fingers trembled slightly as she looked over the selection, knowing that what she was about to do could destroy everything. But she had to know. She couldn't keep living in a state of ignorance, especially when the one person she trusted most seemed to be hiding something from her. She purchased a small, inconspicuous camera, something easy to set up, easy to conceal. When she got home, she took the camera upstairs and set it up in their bedroom, making sure it was hidden in a place where David wouldn't see it. She knew it was risky, that it could backfire in ways she couldn't anticipate. But she couldn't live another day wondering, second-guessing herself, wondering if her suspicions were justified or if she was simply losing her mind. The first night she went through the usual motions. David offered her the wine, as he did every night, and she took it this time with a newfound wariness. As the evening wore on, she waited for the familiar pull of exhaustion, the fog that would cloud her thoughts and steal away her memories. But this time she wasn't going to let it happen. This time she was going to watch, listen, and finally uncover the truth. She lay beside David, her heart racing in anticipation. She forced herself to stay awake to keep her senses sharp as she tried to push the gnawing anxiety from her mind. Hours passed. David's breathing slowed, his body heat radiating beside hers. He drifted off to sleep, just as he always did. And Susan, though exhausted, forced herself to stay alert, her eyes wide open in the dark room. She could feel the tension in the air, the quiet hum of a night that promised to reveal its secrets. Around midnight, the quiet was broken by a soft sound, a click, then the rustle of blankets. Susan's eyes snapped open. She held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. What was that noise? She waited. And then, through the dim moonlight, she saw David stir. His body moved with purpose, with intent. For a moment, Susan was frozen, unsure of what she was seeing. Was he really moving in the way she thought he was? Slowly, he turned toward her, lifting his hand and placed it gently over her mouth, his fingers brushing across her lips with a practiced ease. It was like he had done it before, as though he had rehearsed the motion, as though it was all part of a carefully orchestrated routine. She tried to push him away, to scream, but her body wouldn't respond. Her limbs were heavy, sluggish. The fog she had grown so accustomed to had settled in again, more quickly than ever. And then she remembered the wine. It wasn't just about sleep. It wasn't just about unwinding. He was drugging her. He had been drugging her every night, every time he'd given her that glass, with something that clouded her mind, erased her memories, and left her vulnerable. Susan's world spun as the realization hit her like a freight train. The man she had trusted more than anyone, the man she had married, had been manipulating her, had been controlling her, all along. The hidden camera would reveal the rest. Would it be enough to prove everything she suspected, to uncover the betrayal she feared? Or was she already too deep into a trap of her own making, caught in a web she could never escape? One thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same again. The camera had captured it all, every moment, every breath, every movement. What Susan had feared, what she had suspected deep in the pit of her stomach, was now undeniable. She sat at her desk, the glow of her laptop illuminating her face, her fingers trembling as she clicked play. It was late, well past midnight, but the weight of what she was about to see had kept her awake, had kept her grounded in a cold, biting reality. The footage was grainy, the dim light in the room hardly offering any clarity, but there was no mistaking what she saw. It began like every other night, David moving about, undressing in the soft light, settling beside her, offering her the familiar glass of wine. But what followed was unlike any night Susan had ever known. The camera zoomed in on David's movements as he handed her the drink. He placed it to her lips with a tenderness that Susan now realized was laced with something darker, a false kindness, a sweetness that hid the poison he had been feeding her all along. The wine was never just to help her sleep. It was to cloud her mind, to cloud her memories, to leave her defenseless. Susan's heart raced, her breath shallow as she watched the footage unfold. Her body felt heavy, just like it had the night before, as she drifted off into a deep, foggy sleep. She had no idea what was happening, but the camera didn't lie. And then everything changed. Around midnight, David's body moved with deliberate purpose. He turned to her, placing his hand over her mouth, just as he had done the night before. The camera caught the motion, the press of his fingers against her skin, as if it were all part of a routine. As she could hear the faintest of whispers in the footage, David speaking softly to her. "Just relax, darling. It's for the best." Yet it wasn't her he was speaking to, not entirely. The door to their bedroom creaked open. A figure stepped inside, and Susan's stomach dropped as the man entered the room. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a chiseled jawline, a man Susan had never seen before. His face was familiar to David, though. She saw it in the way Dive greeted him, the way their eyes locked with an intensity that told her all she needed to know. The man was no stranger. This was no accident. This was planned. David stood, his hand still firmly pressing against Susan's mouth, and he spoke in a low, reassuring voice. "It's okay, Susan. Just rest. Everything is going according to plan." The man nodded, taking a step closer to the bed, his expression one of eagerness like someone coming home after a long absence. And then, with the camera capturing it all, Susan watched in stunned horror as David invited his former lover into their bed. The man climbed onto the bed beside her, his hands brushing against her body in ways that made Susan's skin crawl. She felt the heat of his touch through the haze, but she couldn't move, couldn't respond. Her mind was too foggy, her body too paralyzed by whatever drug David had been slipping her. David didn't just stand by, watching as his lover took what he wanted. No, he was an active participant, guiding the man, whispering instructions, offering consent in ways Susan couldn't comprehend. All of it was done with a sense of cold, calculated detachment. This wasn't love. This wasn't even lust. This was betrayal, deep, unrelenting betrayal. Susan's pulse raced as she watched, as she pieced together the fragments of her life that had been hidden from her. This was the life David had been living, while she had been in the dark. This was the man she had married, the man who had deceived her every night with lies wrapped in kindness, with promises that masked his true desires. Her mind reeled. The man she had trusted, the man she had devoted herself to, was nothing like the person she had believed him to be. He wasn't a devoted pastor, a loving husband. He wasn't the man who had promised to love her unconditionally, to build a life with her centered around faith and family. No, David was someone else entirely, someone dark, someone dangerous, someone who had been hiding a mask of righteousness and love for far too long. The camera recorded every agonizing detail. Susan's heart broke with every moment, her body trembling as she watched David and his lover take what was hers. It was a nightmare come to life, and every part of her ached for the person she had once been, the woman who had trusted blindly, who had believed that everything she had been told was true. As the scene played out, Susan's anger began to rise. The devastation of the betrayal was one thing, but the manipulation, the control, the fact that she had been drugged and taken advantage of night after night, it was too much to bear. David had violated her trust in ways that she could never have imagined. He had used her, broken her down, reduced her to a helpless, mindless shell, all in the name of some twisted desire he had been hiding behind his pious facade. The footage ended abruptly. The camera, now running low on battery, captured the final moments as the two men left the bedroom, leaving Susan behind, unaware and vulnerable. The screen went black. Susan sat there in silence, the weight of the truth pressing down on her like a suffocating force. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and for a moment she didn't know whether to scream, to cry, or to simply fall apart. The world she had known, the life she had worked so hard to build, had been shattered in a single, agonizing moment. David had been living a lie for years, and she had been too blind to see it. He had used her as a pawn, a tool to satisfy his own desires while pretending to be the loving husband she had always believed in. The devastation was overwhelming. But in the midst of the pain, something inside Susan began to shift. A quiet strength stirred within her, the realization that she could no longer remain passive in this life. No longer could she accept being the victim. No longer could she live in ignorance of what had been happening to her, to their marriage. She was done. Done with the lies, done with the manipulation. But the question remained, what would she do next? How could she confront David, knowing the depth of his betrayal? How could she begin to untangle the web he had so carefully woven around her? The answers didn't come easily, but they were there. They had to be. Susan took a deep breath, her hands steadying as she closed the laptop. The time for fear was over. The time for truth had arrived. And as painful as it would be, she knew that she had to confront the man who had stolen her life, piece by piece. David had made a grave mistake, and now it was time for him to face the consequences. Her heart burned with a mixture of fury and determination. The truth would not be silenced, and she would be the one to expose it. In the days that followed the revelation, Susan's mind was a storm of violent, unrelenting maelstrom of anger, betrayal, and a kind of twisted clarity that she had never known before. Every piece of her life, every quiet moment she had shared with David, now felt like a cruel joke. She had been nothing more than a pawn in his game, his lies woven so deep into their marriage that she hadn't even recognized the weight of the chains binding her. The anger was raw, sharp, and it was all-consuming. It tore through her every waking moment, a constant ache that refused to be silenced. It was a fire that couldn't be quenched by tears or the hollow promises of redemption. She had been violated, manipulated, betrayed by the man she loved, the man who had claimed to be her protector, her partner in life. David had promised her a future filled with faith, love, and family, but it was all a facade, a carefully constructed lie to mask the darkness he had been hiding for so long. Her mind, once clouded with doubt, now burned with clarity. The truth, as devastating as it was, had set her free in a way she never could have anticipated. But that freedom had come with a price that demanded action, vengeance, justice. The Susan knew she could not simply walk away from this. She couldn't just confront David, ask him why, demand answers. No, this was something deeper, something darker. David had ruined her, broken her in ways that went beyond the physical. He had destroyed the woman she had been, the woman she could have been. He had taken away her right to choose, to live her life without fear, without manipulation. He had stolen her innocence in the cruelest way possible. And now it was time to take back everything he had taken from her. The plan at first was an unsettling thought, just a spark, a fleeting fantasy born out of frustration and hurt. But with every passing day, the idea began to solidify, to take shape. There would be no mercy. There would be no justice through the law. Susan knew that, even if she went to the police, the truth would never be enough to show the depth of his betrayal, the extent of his cruelty. So the punishment had to be personal. It had to be something David could never escape, no matter how far he ran. Her anger didn't allow for hesitation. The more she thought about it, the more her resolve hardened. David would pay for every lie, for every manipulation, for every moment he had stolen from her. It would be the only way to end this. The first step was simple. David had to be made weak, incapacitated, unable to fight back, unable to escape. Or she would drug him the same way he had done to her. She would return the favor, render him helpless, and then she would make him feel the full weight of his betrayal. It was easy to prepare. She had access to the same substances he had used on her. She had watched him carefully enough, had learned his routine, his habits. She knew exactly what he liked, what he expected. She had already seen how a small amount of the drug affected her own body, how it dulled her mind, clouded her thoughts. David, with all his self-righteousness and false piety, would never suspect a thing. Susan carefully measured the dose, just enough to leave him unconscious, but not so much that it would kill him. She slipped the substance into his drink, just as he had done to her so many times before. When David came into the room, unaware of what was about to unfold, he offered her the same familiar smile, the smile that had once made her feel safe, secure, loved. But now it only made her sick to her stomach. "Another drink, darling?" he asked, his voice smooth and casual, as though nothing had changed. Susan took the glass, her fingers brushing against his, feeling the weight of his touch. She smiled back, but it was empty, hollow. "Yes," she said softly. "Thank you." David settled beside her on the couch, unaware that the very drink he had given her would be the last one he ever enjoyed. And she took a sip, just enough to make him believe she had drunk it. The drug would take effect quickly now. She waited in silence, the minutes stretching out, her pulse racing in her chest. She watched as his eyes grew heavy, his movements sluggish. The drug worked swiftly, as she knew it would. David's head slumped to the side, his breath deepening, his body going limp. He was asleep, rendered completely defenseless. Now was the time. With calm precision, Susan stood, taking a deep breath as she prepared herself. The house was quiet, the world outside oblivious to the storm that was about to break inside these walls. She moved toward their bedroom, her footsteps light but sure. Everything had been planned down to the smallest detail. She retrieved the tools she had laid out earlier, the sharp knives, the rope, the cleaning supplies. The dismemberment would be meticulous, deliberate. There could be no mistakes. She had watched enough true crime documentaries to understand the importance of thoroughness. It wasn't just about killing him, it was about erasing him, removing all traces of his existence, making it so that no one would know what had truly happened to him. David had built his life on lies. Now she would destroy the very thing he had clung to for so long, his identity. Susan moved swiftly, her hands steady as she gathered the tools. She had made sure there were no cameras in the house, no surveillance that could capture her actions. She had thought of everything. She returned to the living room, where David lay unconscious, his body a perfect, vulnerable canvas. As Susan stood over him, her gaze cold, calculating. For a moment she looked at him, really looked at him, and wondered how she had ever loved him, how she had ever trusted him, how she had allowed him to take everything from her, to break her down in ways she hadn't even understood at the time. There was no room for pity, no room for hesitation. Her first strike was clean, deliberate. The blade sank into his flesh with a sickening sound, but Susan didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. She was beyond that now. She was beyond fear. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. Each movement was precise, methodical. She worked quickly, tearing away the flesh that had once been her husband's, her hands slick with blood, her mind entirely focused on the task at hand. The anger, the rage, the years of suffering she had endured, every ounce of it was channeled into the violence of her actions. By the time the work was done, David was nothing more than a disjointed, broken form, his body reduced to pieces. Each section, each part of him had been carefully cut away, his identity stripped from him piece by piece. There was no trace left of the man he had been, no hint of the facade circle he'd so carefully crafted. As Susan stood back, breathing heavily, her body covered in his blood, she felt a strange emptiness. It wasn't relief. It wasn't satisfaction. It was something deeper, something colder. She had done it. She had executed the revenge she had so carefully planned, but now that it was over, she felt no triumph. Only the quiet, unsettling realization that her life would never be the same again. The pieces of David were scattered before her, and as she cleaned up, methodically scrubbing away every trace of his existence, she couldn't help but wonder. Had she become the monster she had always feared? Or had she simply become the woman? She was always meant to be someone who would stop at nothing to reclaim her life, her power. The questions lingered, unanswered, as she disposed of what was left of him. The finality of her actions was still settling into her bones, still wrapping around her like a shroud. Susan had done it. She had taken control. She had made David pay for his betrayal in the most extreme way possible. And now there was nothing left but the silence and the knowledge that there was no going back. The silence that followed David's death was suffocating, like the air had thickened, filled with the weight of what had been done. Susan moved through her days with a chilling calm, the shock of her actions slowly giving way to a deep, unsettling numbness. She cleaned up the mess, disposed of the pieces of David in a way that ensured there would be no trace of him left. She told herself it was necessary. She told herself it was justified, but as the days passed, as she moved further from the moment of the crime, the truth began to settle in, heavy the Indian chalking. She had killed him. There had been no turning back, no undoing the damage. The act had been swift and brutal, but the consequences, those would linger. They would haunt her for the rest of her life. What had been intended as revenge, as justice for the betrayal she had endured, had become a dark, irreversible mark on her soul. But it wasn't just her soul that would be marked. There were other lives, other people who would never be the same because of what had transpired. As Susan moved through her days, she went about her life with mechanical precision. But she took care of the house, made sure to dispose of any evidence that might link her to David's death. She went to work, as if nothing had changed, as if the woman who had walked into the office a week ago was still the same. She wasn't. The woman who had once been hopeful, trusting, and full of love for a man she thought she knew was gone. In her place was a woman made of something darker, something more jagged, more broken. Days turned to weeks, and the numbness of it all started to fade. But as it did, something else began to creep. It had been something Susan hadn't expected. The nausea had started subtly, a mild queasiness she initially dismissed as the stress of the past few weeks catching up with her. But as the days passed, the sickness grew worse. She chalked it up to anxiety, to the trauma of what she had done. After all, her body had been through so much in such a short time. The endless nights of drugged sleep, the violent, sickening act she had committed. It all seemed like enough to make her body rebel. But when she missed her period, the truth became impossible to ignore. Susan stood in the bathroom, the small plastic test in her hands, her eyes scanning the results. The world around her felt like it was closing in as she stared at the 2 pink lines. She was pregnant. The shock hit her like a wave, crashing over her, threatening to drown her. She dropped the test in disbelief, her knees buckling beneath her as the weight of the realization settled into her chest. The nausea, the dizziness, the exhaustion, all of it suddenly made sense. But the implications were far more horrifying than she could have ever imagined. She was pregnant. But that wasn't the worst part. As the days passed, Susan began to connect the dots, the timeline, the moment when she had finally allowed herself to confront the truth. The child growing inside her wasn't David's. It wasn't even the child the man she had married. No, this child was the product of David's betrayal, the product of that night, when David had drugged her and invited his lover into their bed. She had never wanted it to happen, never intended for it to happen. But it did. And now she would have to live with the consequences, not just for herself, but for the innocent life growing inside her. The tragedy of it all was unbearable. She had killed David in a fit of rage, thinking it was the only way to get back at him for what he had done to her. But now she was left with the twisted aftermath of her actions, a pregnancy that was a constant reminder of her own destruction, a reminder that in trying to avenge herself, she had brought more pain and suffering into the world than she could ever have imagined. Susan thought about the child often in the days that followed. What kind of life would this child have? What kind of mother could she be? Knowing that the circumstances of their conception were rooted in violence and manipulation and betrayal, how could she raise a child when she was still trying to make sense of her own brokenness, still reeling from the choices she had made? The days turned into weeks and Susan, her turmoil deepened. She couldn't turn back time. She couldn't undo what had been done, no matter how hard she wished for it. But the pregnancy, this new life growing inside her, seemed to be a constant reminder that the past would never be truly behind her. But she couldn't think about it for long. The events of the past weeks had already begun to attract attention, and Susan could feel the walls closing in. There was no way to avoid the inevitable. She had been too careful, too thorough in covering her tracks. but there were always cracks. And eventually someone would find them. It wasn't long before the police began to piece together the puzzle. The investigation had started slowly, nothing more than a missing persons report. A man who had seemingly vanished without a trace. But then came the small signs, the inconsistencies. A neighbor who had noticed strange behavior from David and Susan leading up to his disappearance. A call made to a friend, a curious discrepancy in the details Susan had given to investigator. At first they hadn't suspected her. Why would they? She was a grieving widow after all, and no one had seen the signs of what had truly happened behind closed doors. But as the weeks wore on, the questions grew more pointed. The small inconsistencies, the unusual details began to add up. The authorities found evidence that suggested foul play. It wasn't long before they turned their attention to Susan. They discovered the hidden camera in the bedroom, Suzanne's own recordings of David's betrayal. They found traces of the drugs that had been used to sedate her. And when they finally managed to uncover the remains of David's body, carefully disposed of in various parts of the city, it was all too clear. But Susan had been arrested within days of the investigation, picking up speed. Her cold, methodical actions had sealed her fate. And as the evidence piled up against her, she realized the full scope of her actions. There was no getting out of this now, no escaping the consequences of what she had done. And then there was the other man, the lover. He too had been caught up in the investigation. He hadn't planned on any of it, hadn't known how far Susan would go to exact her revenge. But once the police had linked him to the crime, he became just as implicated as she was. The trial was swift, and the evidence was damning. Susan and the lover both faced legal consequences that would follow them for the rest of their lives. For Susan, it was a life sentence, one that would be lived out behind bars, the world outside for forever closed to her. The lover faced years in prison for his part in the crime, though it was clear that Susan had been the one to orchestrate the entire thing. And yet, even in the midst of all the chaos, the tragedy and the horror, there remained one final unspoken question. What would happen to the child? The unborn child that had been conceived in violence, in betrayal, now grew inside Susan's body. The child that would never know the man who had given them life, who would never understand the twisted circumstances of their conception. And Susan, she would be left to raise this child, knowing that their existence was a direct result of the choices she had made, of the anger that had consumed her. Would the child, born into this world of lies and pain, ever know peace? Would they ever understand the weight of the secrets that had shaped their life, their very existence? So David's secrets had not only destroyed his life, but had irreparably altered the lives of those around him. And the legacy of his betrayal, the consequences of his actions, would echo long after the trial was over, long after the final sentence was passed. The impact of his lies would endure not just for Susan, who would live out her days in prison, but for the innocent child who would be born into a world tainted by the very things David had hidden away. And so the cycle continued, an unending ripple of pain, of betrayal, of broken trust, stretching far beyond the lives of those directly involved. Like and subscribe to our channel for more gripping tales that dive deep into the human experience, exploring the dark corners of the mind and the secrets we hide from the world.